Discover prototypical track and turnouts with the Roadmaster series from Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply. Proudly made in the United States, Oak Hill's handcrafted turnouts provide unparalleled detail and accuracy, giving your layout museum-quality track work at an affordable price. Whether fully built or in easy-to-assemble kit form, Roadmaster provides all the details of real track. Looking for a custom piece of track work? Oak Hill can help with custom turnouts, diamonds, crossings, and more. Check out all of their offerings on their website, ohrtracksupply.com. If you're looking to bring more realism to your layout industries, look no further than tullymodels.com, the home of Southern Tier Grain Modeler Supply and Steel Mill Modeler Supply. With models to fit steam, transition, and diesel eras, Kevin Tully has you covered with all of the components you'll need to take your grain and steel mills to the next level. Check out the entire catalog at tullymodels.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. On this show, we're going to be talking about affordable model railroading, and joining me to do that, Matt Forcum. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to see you again, Matt. I saw your video on YouTube, and I was just so fired up about the concept and the idea of what the hobby is costing nowadays. And of course, we see these next new shiny things coming out of all these great manufacturers, and then we see the price tags, and it's just a constant pull on a wallet. But I really liked your video and what you were talking about in that video. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but this show's goal is to talk a little bit about how we can keep some guardrails and keep the hobby affordable, especially getting started in the hobby and not being overwhelmed by those big price tags.
Yeah, that video was one that I sort of got the inspiration to put together. I was cruising around on Reddit one day, which is dangerous as it is, but I was in kind of the model train section of Reddit. And I had actually seen several posts from people who were brand new to the hobby, who didn't really know anything about the hobby. I think, maybe they might have found an old train set in grandfather's attic or something at a garage sale, and they said, hey, this is pretty cool. Oh, I remember seeing these when I was a kid. I want to get in. Where do I go? How much is this going to cost me? I have no clue. And for me, I am somebody who, I like a lot of hobbies. I kind of get like really excited about a hobby for like 4 or 5 months, and I dive like deep into it. And then I end up putting it on a shelf somewhere and jumping to something else. And model railroading is my main hobby, but I got a lot of other hobby interests. And one of the things that I always like to do when I'm getting into a hobby for the first time is I want to know how much is this going to cost me, because I don't want to waste my money. And I also don't want to like go down sort of the wrong road as a beginner and, head off in a direction that's maybe not right for me. Where can I most effectively and efficiently spend my money so that I'm getting the most enjoyment out of the hobby? And model railroading, I think, is one of those hobbies where there's a lot of directions you can go, especially when you're just starting out and you have nothing, right? You're starting from zero. And what I wanted to do is really kind of give a little bit of direction, but also just an idea of like, well, I don't want to say that there's like one specific way to enjoy model railroading, certainly. And hopefully out of the course of this conversation that we have today, people will get that idea that like, however you want to enjoy the hobby is certainly up to you. But there are ways to sort of maximize your dollar spent in such a way that you can set yourself up for success. And so you don't find yourself down, a dead end, if you will, or you've gone too far in one direction, realizing, if I would have just known this as a beginner, I could have righted the course, if you will, or something like that. I don't know what the right analogy is for that, but that was the intent of the video. I had wanted to do a follow-up to that video where I went a little more deep into some of these subjects. And right around that time, you had reached out to me and said like, hey, let's do a podcast. So I'm really thankful that you brought me on tonight to talk about that, so I don't have to do this video.
Well, I'll save you from the video. We'll do a little audio podcast here and talk about it and maybe dive into a little bit deeper. We'll share the link to that video, though, on our website, aroundthelayout.com/142. you'll be able to check it out and see what Matt has done. And of course, the entire channel that he is done as well. But yeah, it seems like kind of like murky waters or muddy waters or whichever way you want to look at it. It's when you get new in the hobby and then you see all these amazing layouts that are out there, and it can overwhelm the mind. And then you start thinking about the dollars that go into these massive operations of layouts, and
Right.
a massive fleet of locomotives, a massive amount of rolling stock, and amazing scenery, and incredible, very complicated bench work. And I guess when folks see that and think that that's the only part of the hobby, it could, it almost is fearful to me that they run away from it instead of
Yeah.
saying, well, not knowing the whole story, that they didn't start there. They may
Yeah.
have ended there, and that's the part you're seeing. But what the part you didn't see is kind of the stuff we're hopefully going to be able to cover a bit in this podcast and be able to show folks you can work your way to that, but the starting point isn't nearly as deep as you may think it is.
Yeah, exactly. You'll see like in the magazines or on Facebook or on YouTube or whatever these huge beautiful layouts, and you want that for yourself. And certainly I do. And when I was a kid, just getting in the hobby for the first time, seeing the amazing layouts in Model Railroader magazine, I'm like, that is what I want, right? And so I think there can be a tendency to just like spend your way to try to get there. um,
Yeah,
getting the most expensive locomotives, building the biggest layout you can possibly squeeze into your basement and that kind of thing. And that's where I'm getting at when I say like you can find yourself down almost like a dead end where you've gone very far down a road that you really shouldn't be traveling down yet, and you really kind of should bring it back, bring it down, make it a little smaller, a little more careful, take a break, pump the brakes a little bit there. You'll get there eventually, but starting out, you should really focus on other things instead of the biggest and the best, right?
absolutely. So let's talk about the precursor to this video. What got you in the mindset where you wanted to even create a video where you're talking about, how expensive is model railroading?
Yeah. So I have, if you've visited my channel or would like to, I've just started a brand new small modular model railroad in addition to the one I'm currently working on, which is a room size layout. And my intention with the smaller layout was well, for the channel, just be able to start over from scratch and kind of show the process of building a small layout and what you can do in a very small space, and how much fun and detail and everything else that goes into even on something on a very small footprint. So you don't need to go spend a lot of time and energy and money doing something big. You can focus on something small. And I chose an era in the 1950s, which is way outside of my modern era, which meant all new locomotives, meant all new rolling stock. I'm building benchwork again for the first time. I'm looking at DCC systems again for the first time, which is something I really hadn't done in a bunch of years. And kind of looking at it from fresh eyes, looking all over eBay. I'm looking at all the supplier sites and stuff online, and I'm starting to look at that from fresh eyes and thinking like, okay, so if I'm starting from scratch here, somebody else is starting from scratch here too. So the things that I'm looking at that are new and fresh to me, they're going to be new and fresh for somebody else. So what can I offer as far as expectations for price, where to go to look for things, and all that kind of stuff to help people as they're starting out as well.
And as you started to do that, what were you finding out there?
It was a little surprising. I mean, obviously prices have gone up since I started, but there are areas where you can really find some good cost savings. And I think maybe we can get into areas where we can do some cost savings as you're building out your model railroad. I think we're all attracted to the nicest, newest locomotives with the greatest detail. Manufacturers out there like Rapido and Scale Trains and Athearn Genesis who are doing these beautiful, amazing locomotives. But then you have things like Waller's Mainline, which, unless you looked really, really closely, those things look pretty darn good as well. And they're sometimes half the price of some of the more expensive manufacturers. Not to throw anybody under the bus, because everyone's kind of doing their own thing for a different person with a different idea of what they want from the hobby. But you shouldn't look at what everyone else is doing and think, I have to do that as well, right? Those Waller's Mainline locomotives are gorgeous, and they're really drawing me for the price tag for what they were. They were excellent DCC sound equipped locomotives for, a very decent price. Some of this is going to be like do what I say, not as I do, because I do tend to just like buy.
Sure.
But if you take a step back and take a look at your options and figure out, what's going to be the best move for me. If I can save $100 on a less expensive locomotive, that's $100 I can spend somewhere else. Maybe some additional rolling stock. Save it for my bench work. Save it for the paint supplies that I'm going to need as I go along there. When you're finding more economical ways of gathering all the stuff you need to from the very beginning, it's just leaving room there for some of the stuff that kind of creeps up that you even don't maybe necessarily think about. For example, track work. I ended up having to buy more flex track than I thought I was going to have to buy. And that's, some more cash out of my wallet that was unexpected, but required in order to finish my modular layout. And those unexpected outlays of cash are going to creep up. So, planning to knowing that you have to spend that occasionally, but setting yourself up for success there by being really diligent to buy less expensive equipment is helpful there.
Yeah. So it really sounds like to me that it starts with a plan, right?
It starts with a plan.
Really,
I should have said that from the beginning. It starts with a plan.
No, and I think that's key to it. And we've heard terms being used on the podcast. I really like our mutual friend Matt Fricks, who's been on the podcast a couple times, uses that term guardrails. And knowing Matt, he stole it from somebody else. So it wasn't his term, but he stole it and he used it and he's kind of perfected that kind of the mentality of guardrails. And so is our also mutual friend with Isaac Fabris, who's set some really solid guardrails with a even more detailed plan. But it's in that planning process that you really start going. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think half of model railroading is planning, right? And maybe even more. I don't know. I spend so much time on Google image search or Google Maps looking at, where track is running in a particular prototype area, or, what cars it can be found in an area I'm interested in modeling. That all goes into the planning process, because then you can sort of, if you can pick an era, if you can pick a prototype, now you've sort of not shrunk things down, but you've put those guardrails up so that like, hey, I'm only buying BNSF locomotives. I'm only buying equipment manufactured between, say, 1980 and no later than 2016, right? You're starting to put those guardrails up for yourselves. And so some of the newer, fancier cars out there, they look great, but my wallet's safe because it's outside of my era. Another thing that I'm doing for my little modular layout is I am limiting myself to 30 cars maximum. So I'm not just buying anything that just captures my attention out there. So, here's yet another B&O box car. Once I hit that 30 car maximum, I don't need any more cars to operate this layout. I have all the cars I need, and those 30 cars will keep me busy for years with weathering and detailing and everything else that goes along with that kind of thing. And say further down the road, I find a car that I really, really like. I can buy that car, but I'm gonna have to sell something in order to justify bringing that car into my inventory. And selling that other car, helps go to pay for that. So, those guardrails that you can kind of put on something, so you can say, hey, I'm doing this. I'm doing this era. I'm only buying this amount of stuff. That sort of planning you can do ahead of time can really help sort of keep you honest in a lot of ways, because it's very easy to get on eBay one afternoon and then, suddenly you find yourself with a cart full of cars that you didn't expect to purchase earlier that morning. And, you can get yourself sort of not in trouble, but you can get yourself in a place where like, oh, now I'm starting to go down that road that I shouldn't have gone down to begin with. Right.
I think too, one of the big things in the early planning stages, maybe the best tool to get to try to figure it out is a mirror, right? And take a look at yourself and decide a couple different factors that seem to come into play. And also knowing what are you going to be able to handle to get started.
Yeah.
Not getting yourself a layout that's going to completely overwhelm you to a point of analysis paralysis where you'll stop. And then knowing what type of prototype or freelance type railroading you're going to do that you're going to be able to fit in, and what it's going to take to truly replicate that.
Yeah.
And one that comes to mind is like, okay, let's start with, class one railroads, right? If I'm going to model a major line, say I was going to model CSX that goes from Albany to Buffalo, right? That's a lot of railroad. And
Yeah.
to truly model that means I'm going to need a lot of real estate to try to do that big type class one railroading. And if I have a 10 by 10 room, I'm likely not going to be able to model that all that well.
Yeah. And I think there are people out there who they want that giant railroad, but they just either you don't have the house yet for it, right? You may be in your starter home, or you may be in an apartment, and you love that big line and those big locomotives and all that scenery and everything, but you just can't fit it in your space. I have a good friend who is modeling the Cascade subdivision. He's a young guy, young father. He's in kind of a starter space himself. He doesn't have the space for the entire Cascade subdivision. He's modeling a small switching layout that's one small piece of the larger puzzle. And then as he moves into a larger home, he can bring that starter layout, the little modular layout with him and add on to it. And then eventually he'll get to the point where he can build that dream Cascade subdivision that he has in his head. It might be a number of years down the road, but he's not stopping himself right now. He's got his modular layout that he's building, and he's his switching layout, and enjoying it. He's collecting cars and weathering cars and doing everything that will work great for the big thing, the full thing, once he gets there down the road. But he's not letting the fact that he doesn't have the room for it stop him, and he's being very smart in how he's planning for that eventual layout. I have seen people who, this is my first layout and I'm filling my entire basement with a 3-deck, Empire, and they get, 5 years into the project and nothing's running yet, and they get frustrated and they stop. It's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know, right? When you're starting out in any hobby, model roading including, you don't know just how much work goes into filling a whole basement full of track, right? Until you get into it and you realize, oh, I got myself in over my head. So starting small, I think, is a really great way to go. You're not buying tons of track. You're not buying tons of, locomotives or cars or anything like that to get started. And I think that that's the most important thing.
It goes back to kind of the idea, the concept of the flywheel, right? Keep that flywheel turning and get the flywheel to start turning. And I think, I know for me, when I started looking at it, that you start to build a layout and you think you're pigeonholed or you're committed to this being your forever layout. And the example you gave proves exactly the opposite, that it can be a 1, 2, 3, 5, 10-year layout. You can put a time limit on your layout and say, hey, I know I'm going to build something small. This isn't the end. I have this dream in the back of my head that I think is my dream. I don't even know. I don't even know. Heck, I don't even know what the heck I'm doing tomorrow, let alone what I'm doing in 5 or 10 years. But I would like to in 5 and 10 years to be able to do something. But for now, here's what I can handle. Here's what my budget, my time, what I can commit to is maybe something smaller. In this whole wave that seems to be coming with shelf layouts, with these smaller shelf layouts and switching layouts, is really a blessing, because it's now an opportunity to get into it without having to wait for the real estate in the areas and the budget and everything. You can start small and then keep it in a very obtainable way, get that flywheel turning and keep it moving.
Attainable, I think, is key there. My main layout is a room size layout. It's the second version of this layout. The first version was a 2 by 10 foot switching layout that was built on a couple of modules in the basement of my starter home. And as I was building that layout, as I would find deals, collecting more cars than I would be able to use on that little modular layout. I was buying senior materials that were meant for some other layout one day, right? And being able to buy that slowly over time, I was able to build up, knowing that I would eventually get there. And now I'm here. Now I'm building, the layout of my dreams. But it's been 15, probably, about 15 years of slowly collecting things to get to this point where, like, now I'm building it, right? But by doing a little bit of a time, biting off a piece of that at a time. It is just a great way to keeping it affordable, because otherwise you're going to find yourself like, hey, I need 150 cars, I need 12 locomotives, and
Yeah.
you find yourself going like, oh, I can't even afford this hobby, right? Keeping it small helps keep it affordable. And then knowing that like this isn't necessarily your last layout. There may be layouts in the future. If you really love, say, the Cascade subdivision, you can build 40 different Cascade subdivisions if you'd like, that's all up to you. But, you can start small and then just work your way up from there.
Yeah, for sure. Get that flywheel turning, get
Mm-hmm.
into the hobby. And I jokingly say, and kind of hypocritical as a podcaster, but you can only talk the hobby for so long, and then you need to do it. And this is a
Yeah.
way to start doing it and getting your hands dirty, and in smaller ways and manageable ways that avoids all of that analysis paralysis and gets you into it. So now, a little self reflection in deciding, okay, this is what really kind of fits me. What are some of the ways, we talk about the things that you're going to need, and we'll talk about a small switching layout, and
Mm-hmm.
the ways that you can kind of do that. And you started to mention about locomotives, and talk about
Yeah.
that, because there's again different levels of locomotives. You want something
Yeah.
that's going to be reliable running, but you don't necessarily need every single detail on them.
Yes. So I think that, and one thing I did in that video we talked about at the beginning, I was suggesting kind of buying everything new, especially if you're a brand new model railroader. Going on eBay, you can find some great deals, but I don't know that I would, as a first time model railroader, buy a locomotive on eBay, even if I could find a great deal for it. Because if you don't know much about what you're buying, you might not realize you're buying a broken locomotive, or a locomotive that, yeah, it's DCC ready, but what that means is you've got to wire that thing in yourself. And if you're a brand new model railroader, that may not be something you're looking forward to doing. And there are great locomotives that run very well, that have DCC and sound installed, that are at a very decent price. And I think that starting out, there are areas where I think it makes sense to maybe spend a little bit more money, such as getting a nice locomotive, getting a nicer DCC system, because you can take those with you, on that next layout. You can still run that same locomotive. You can still run that same DCC system. And so when we're talking here about affordable model railroading, I'm not saying like cheap model railroading. What I'm saying is like smart ways of spending your money, right?
Right.
So, $150 for a locomotive is, I think that's an affordable way to start out. And you're getting a locomotive that you're going to be guaranteed will run well. It's, new and modern, has, a good DCC decoder in there. It'll work well with any DCC system out there. It'll work well with other locomotives that you purchase in the future. A locomotive that's reliable, that you don't need to worry about needing to be greased or anything like that. I think that that's a great way to go. There are a couple of very nice DCC systems that are, and I'm using quotes here, cheap, because DCC is, nothing's ever super cheap, but DCC can be a little more expensive than just going straight DC, which is, where I think a lot of us started off with back in the day. But I do think for a new model railroader, starting DCC, I think, is a great way to go. It's simpler in some ways. If you add another locomotive to your fleet, you can, consist them together and run them together on your layout. Having the sound is excellent. Some additional features with speed adjustment and momentum and everything else that kind of comes along with that just adds a lot more sort of fun and options to the hobby. And so maybe saving a little bit of cash, saving up for a DCC for your layout, I think is a smart way to start out.
So kind of the key takeaway regarding locomotives, there's a lot of options out there, and there's a lot of amazing brands out there with
Mm-hmm.
basically the Cadillacs of locomotives. But in sense, and you look at the price tag, and you might go, geesh, yeah, that's a lot of money, but it's not something you have to have, and you don't need to have right away. There's ways to do it, and
Exactly.
then eventually grow to those. You can
Right.
start with some of the baseline locomotive offerings that still come with DCC sound, that are a decent reliable. And I think that's the key point, is reliability, and what you were hitting on, new versus finding, buying somebody else's problems. you can find a good way to do that, and
Right.
then eventually grow and move your fleet forward, or even just take some of these base locomotives and start adding detail to them to bring
Yeah.
them up to that level
100%.
is another option too.
Yeah, absolutely. That locomotive. I mean, one of the great things I love about the hobby is uh, stuff you buy. I mean, stuff from the 1970s works just fine today, right? And if you detail it up, if you weather it up, it looks just as good. And then that's yours. I still have my very first HO scale locomotive that I ever purchased, and that's something that I'm going to keep with me. And yeah, I can pull it out and run it on the layout, and it works just fine. So, absolutely, like a decent, reliable, well-running locomotive from a railroad that you love, BNSF or Union Pacific or Pennsy or whatever it might be. That'll get you excited. It'll get you excited to watch it running around the layout and all that, and it helps sort of keep those juices flowing for the hobby.
So now we've talked a little bit about locomotives. Now we need a little bit of track to run it on. Let's talk about selecting track
Sure.
and trying to keep that in a manageable way.
Yeah, and I think at this point, like you've purchased a locomotive, you've purchased a DCC system, maybe, and you're like, "Ooh, I got a lot of money. I got a lot of money to leave my wallet. Where can I find the cheapest track?" And I don't know that you necessarily need to do that. I think a decent track, it doesn't have to be the most expensive stuff out there. The switches don't have to be the most expensive switches out there. I would say don't, dig around in the bargain bin for the old brass track from the 1970s or whatever. Like, get yourself some nice nickel silver track, flex track, and decent switches, and that just goes to the whole reliability thing. I mean, I think the worst thing in the world is nailing down a bunch of track and just finding like none of it's working really good. This is frustrating, right? And so anything you can do to sort of prevent as much frustration as possible is going to help you sort of have most success in the hobby. If your track is nice and your locomotives are nice and it's all running and working well together, then you're going to have a good time, right? If your locomotives are happy, if your track work is happy, you're going to be happy as well. Where you're going to spend a little more money is going to be in locomotives, it's going to be in track work, and then you can start to save money when you get into scenery, because there's a lot of ways of like getting into building structures, adding scenery to the layout and all that kind of stuff that is cost effective and looks great. And once you're past like the expensive part, which is the track, those rolling stock, those locomotives, then you're into the fun of like building the scenery, and you can sort of sit back a little bit and let your wallet rest a little bit.
On the subject of track, I want to also mention, there's different levels of track too. And it comes to, you have some of your base track, the most popular brands like Atlas, and then
Mhm.
you have there's other finer detailed track. Walters has some of their own track, and then the micro engineering track, which is highly detailed track. But there's ways to get around it, and if you want to model, and I'll put in the link the for one of the Lance Minheim's books where he talks about track. There's ways to make Atlas track look good, and there's no
Sure.
knock on Atlas. There's, but paint it darker, and Lance gives some really good advice regarding track. So you don't think that you have to immediately go to the hobby shop and buy micro engineering or buy the most
Right.
expensive levels. You can start there and then eventually grow. You can change that track out in time if that highly detailed track is what you want to get into, or if you want to pick an even bolder step, hand laying track, and then but that doesn't
Mhm.
have to happen on day one
Right.
and day two, and then on your first layout to get acclimated with the hobby. There's certainly nothing wrong with getting that affordable Atlas track to be able to do it, and reliability. And this one
Mhm.
thing that doesn't cost any bit of money is taking your time and making sure you're laying quality track down.
100%. Yeah. Like really slowing down when you're building, especially the track work, and, taking your time with it and making sure it's glued down nicely and everything's laid straight and all the joints are, together nicely, all that kind of stuff. That will definitely take you a long ways in making sure that you're going to have a nice, reliable layout going forward for sure.
All right, so let's talk through some processes here. Or the steps here. We've got locomotives, we've got some
Mhm.
track, we've got a DCC system that's feeding DCC to this track. Now we need these locomotives to be able to pull something. Let's talk a little bit about rolling stock. what are some of the opportunities to slowly work your way into rolling stock and keep that expense under control?
I think the best way to get into rolling stock is to go to like a train show or a swap meet or something like that, and taking a look at what's available out there. Even your local hobby store, if you're lucky enough to have one in your area. But getting your hands on rolling stock and seeing, okay, this is what, it's one thing to see it like on the internet or on eBay or whatever. But when I can hold it in my hands and I can tell the difference between an Atlas Master Series car versus a Walther's mainline car and see like what's most important to me here. Is it detail? Is it color? Is it the overall? Am I just happy with the overall shape looking a certain way? And those train shows, I think, are probably the best deals, right? Uh, Guys with a bunch of cars laid out on a table. I think that's the best way to get those deals. eBay can be a little tricky. A lot of stuff is sold as quote unquote new in box on eBay. That's really not.
Yeah.
I just received a car the other day that was broken grab irons and missing coupler boxes that was sold as new to me, so now I got to replace all that. But I've got a little more experience in the hobby. I can suffer through that. But if you're just starting out, that might be a little much. So eBay's tricky. I mean, you can get good deals on eBay for sure. And I do recommend like looking for those deals, but until you like get it in your hands, you really understand like what it is I'm looking at here. You may not know, like, is this car really worth $20? Is this car really worth $40? That kind of thing. So that's where I think where swap meets and train shows really shine, is just getting it in your hands and looking at it and saying, okay, this is a great car for $20.
I also like the concept of rolling stock as well. Of it doesn't have to be the top of the line car either. It can be
Absolutely.
something when you're operating, and this is something I've noticed too. I notice all of these fine details on these cars when I'm looking at them and I'm buying them. But once they go into operations, when you start running them on a layout, all those
Yep.
details seem to go away, and
Yeah.
what you're really focused on. So to get started, and again, there's good, better, and best out there. Get yourself in the good and better categories before you get yourself to the best categories.
Yeah.
Get yourself some rolling stock, even if it's stand in. There's nothing wrong with that. This may not be the exact car they were running, but it's a good stand in to get started. And then you can eventually work towards replacing that with the right car.
100%. Yeah, I have a good mix of cars on my layout. I have some of like the super high end stuff, but I lash it up right next to cars with molded in grab irons and stuff, and they both look absolutely great together. And I think that that's something, especially when you're first starting out, you're nervous that like, oh, if I buy that cheaper thing, are people going to think differently about me, right? And honestly, I've never been to an operating session where I've judged anyone else's cars, right? I'm there, I'm enjoying operating, I'm enjoying a whole new layout and a whole new experience. And I've never looked at somebody's gondola and said, oh, that underbody detail is not as good as it could have been, right? It's never been, for me personally, it might be a little bit different, right? Because it's my own sort of like personal what I want for myself. But I've never looked at anyone else's stuff and judged them based on, the how much money they spent on a car or whatever. And I think we need to get past that as model railroaders. And I think, once you're in the hobby long enough, you realize like people don't really care so much when they're over at your house. It's nice. I appreciate a really nice high end car when I see it roll by or whatever, but do I appreciate it $40 more seeing the high end one versus the medium or lower end one? Probably not, especially when there's a whole train of like 20 of them. It's probably not worth the money you spend on something like that. But yeah, and just like with locomotives, you can always detail that car later. You can always, add separately applied details. And weathering goes so far into making even, a nice, inexpensive, affordable car look top of the line. And so yeah, don't feel like you need to have the best of the best of the best to feel like you're part of the group, right? I think that in any hobby, there we all fall into that trap where we're sort of just trying to keep up with the Joneses. And model railroading, there's so much to the hobby of model railroading, and how much you spend on a particular piece of rolling stock is such a small part of that nobody cares, right?
I just know when I go to an operating session, one, I'm just thrilled that I got an invitation to be there.
Absolutely.
And then
Yeah.
secondly, I'm not judging at all. The things that I'm really looking for, are they interesting ops? Are they keeping me occupied?
Yep.
Are the locomotives running reliably? I don't care about necessarily
Yes.
all the details on it. I just want to know that it's running well and I'm not having to five finger the train across the layout.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you don't have those type of people showing up at your operating sessions that are understanding and supportive and just happy to be there, you're inviting the wrong people.
Right.
And your problem isn't your locomotives or your rolling stock, it's your operating crew, and it's time
Yeah.
to make some changes. Hopefully you don't get to that point, but yeah, a lot of the people in the hobby understand, because most of us have all been at that beginning where we're trying to figure all of this out and navigate what could be a very confusing
Yeah.
market of available products. So yeah, again, just know what's important in what's really, priority, and that's just good running layouts and decent rolling stock that's going to give a good representation of what would be functioning in that case, but then may not be exact. It may not be rivet counter.
Right.
It may not be the 100% on, but it's going to, help you tell
Yeah.
your story a bit.
Yeah. And I've been in that spot where, okay, I need bulkhead flat cars, and there wasn't a whole lot out there options wise. Well, Athearn has a nice cheap bulkhead flat car, so I bought a bunch of those and was using them during operating sessions, and they work just fine, and no complaints, and they look great and all that stuff. And then later on, I found more accurate bulkhead flat cars, and so I just replaced them. I sold the other ones off and bought the newer ones, and honestly, not much has changed. There's operating sessions still work as they always did. It's just a different car in place, and it's more accurate. And for me, that feels a little bit better. And for those who know, that's maybe a little bit better as well. But I'm, I didn't let it stop me, not having the perfect car right off the bat. And I also wasn't like stressing about trying to track down and maybe overspend on eBay for something that would have been just a slightly more accurate or slightly better detailed. That wasn't where I needed to focus my attention or my wallet at that point, right?
Absolutely. So now that we've got all of the locomotives and rolling stock and track, and we've got a DCC system, now we want to try to start making this look like an actual railroad. So we're going to try to work on some scenery. Let's talk about scenery and the ways that you can work towards some great scenery without breaking the bank.
Yeah, there's a lot of options for sure. Natural scenery products. I will in the fall go out and collect leaves and dry them out, and then the next fall I'll have a garbage bag full of dry leaves that I can crush up for ground cover, sifted dirt. This is all stuff that's basically free. If you're living in certain parts of the country, you might be able to find a bush that makes for pretty decent looking trees. So natural scenery materials, that's all really good. Static grass is not that expensive. Brown foam is not that expensive. Again, going into it with a plan, knowing what it is that you're knowing the time of year that you're planning on modeling, having good reference photos of what you're looking for, and that way you can plan out like, hey, I know I'm going for this color, so I need to look for stuff that's in this color instead of just buying anything that's green. It needs to be this light green because it's early spring or whatever. With that plan, with that research in place, you can start to make smart decisions about what you buy. White glue and water. You can do a lot with white glue and water, regular school glue and water. You don't need expensive glues or stuff in order to make any of this work.
And one thing too about scenery is that it's easily replaced, and it can be
Absolutely.
taken out and redo it.
So easy. Yeah, spray down with water and get a spatula out there and just start scraping.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you talked about using dirt and using leaves and grinding it. And there's tons and tons and tons of YouTube videos on how to do that, how to sift dirt and get dirt that, so that you can start using that for
Yeah.
ground cover. And I think part of that too is the planning. Like for me, it's try to keep it simple. Do a little bit of simplicity in your plan. Don't go for the most complicated scenery right away. Get the
Yeah.
base idea. Get yourself where the flywheel's turning. Okay, now I'm doing some ground cover. Now I'm starting to understand. Now I'm dabbling with some static grass. Don't try to build the most mountainous, rock filled terrain with intricate details and water pouring over the rocks. And those are things you can work on and slowly
Yeah.
start to add that into a layout. But don't let that be the hang up where I got to have this massive, beautiful, eye catching scene to be able to get going. Don't let that hold you back. Start simple, work your way into those things.
Yeah. Well, even things like if you take a look at your square footage of your lot and you figure, okay, I'm going to need 150 trees. Don't go buy 150 trees. Like
Yeah.
buy 10 trees. Start there and see if you like the trees that you purchased or the technique for creating the trees that you're utilizing. And then from there, if you like it, then you can buy more materials and start to build the rest of those 140 trees out. That's one thing that I struggle with myself. I know I need a lot of X amount of material, so I will go out and buy a lot of X amount of materials, and they'll just sit there for years because I'm 5 years away from getting to that point, right? And it's like, why did I buy all this stuff? I could have saved my money and focused on other areas of my layout otherwise. So don't feel like you need to just grab everything all at once because you'll need it eventually. It'll be there 5 years down the road. You'll be able to find static grass 5 years down the road if you need it. Focus on other areas first, right?
Absolutely. And then the other piece of scenery I kind of put in that same category is buildings. And
Oh yeah,
we don't need to start with craftsman kits. We can start very
yeah,
simplistic with buildings or even objects that come in and stand in as buildings as we're starting to figure this all out.
100%. I have several buildings on my layout that are just sheets of foam core. That stuff that you use to make dioramas for school or whatever. Cut out pieces of foam core and put it in a rough building shaped object and stick it on your layout, and it works perfectly to give you kind of an idea of like, okay, this is roughly what one day the whole vision of it. And another thing I do too is I'll take a little photograph of the prototype building that I'm going to model eventually, and I'll stick it right there on that little foam core building. And so whoever's over operating my layout, they can see, okay, here's a box that's supposed to represent a paper mill, but here's a photograph of what the actual paper mill is. And you can put two and two together and have yourself a really good time that way. You don't need to worry about buying all the details for that paper mill that you're going to build one day all at once. Start something simple like foam core board and go from there.
One of the folks we've had on very early in the start of the podcast, Mike King, his layout, you would think that some parts of his layout were all Amazon warehouses, but they're not. They're Amazon boxes flipped upside down. And he's used those to start to fill out and kind of get the feel of what size building he's going to need in
Yeah,
operations. And that surely has saved him a lot of money in styrene or in Walther's kits or even Craftsman kits, etc. Because now he's just using that box that he really didn't pay for, that he's kind of flipped over, and he keeps changing the size or
yeah,
figuring out where the door locations need to be. And he can use that as a fill in until he's ready to start building those buildings and start to put them in place. And
right.
even when he does, remember that you can still upgrade a building too. Just as much as in the real world, they knock them down and build new buildings. You can do the same thing for your layout.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're all creative people. I mean, model railroaders are very creative people. So we can take a look at that Amazon box and recognize that one day it's going to look different, right? That shouldn't stop us at all or from enjoying what we have.
So we've skimmed over a lot of topics. We kind of threw, some of the, just the very kind of off the top items that you would need to
Yeah,
start looking at. And boy, we could just dive deep into all of these and spend hours upon hours talking about that. But I hope the overall message that folks get out of this, again, is you don't need to break the bank to get started.
exactly. Also, know that model railroading is a journey. And I think starting out, you may not even realize just how much goes into model railroading and the research, the planning, the initial steps, your first steps into laying down track work and your first layer of scenery. It's a slow, it's a model railroad is never people say model railroad is never completed, but it's never completed quickly. And that's part of what makes model railroading great, the journey. I love the journey of building a model railroad. And for me, that extends over years and years and years. And if you're a model railroader, that's what it is. It's years and years of slow, careful, planned production. And if you keep that in mind, it's you realize like whatever I buy today will be used tomorrow, right? Be smart about what I'm buying now, because down the line, I can still keep that. I can still keep that locomotive around. I can still keep that DCC system around or that track work around. And knowing that this purchase decision I'm making now is important for me. It helps keep me from just making quick, rash decisions when I'm purchasing something. Oh, I love BNSF. This thing says BNSF on the side of it. I'm going to buy it, right? No. How is this going to work into my layout? How is this going to work into future plans for my layout? Where is this going to live on my layout? Do I really need it? And do I really need it now? And that planning, that careful consideration, I think will help set you up for success as you are journeying your way through this great hobby of ours.
Absolutely. It definitely is a journey. The destination is, I don't know. Sometimes I think unreachable because a layout is never done. So you're always, and I think that's part of just enjoying that journey. And then the other part of that too, you talked about the planning and the research. If right now you have no money and or no space, that research takes up no space and really is cost you nothing to dive in, to start doing the things. We had Isaac Fabris on here talking about all the research he's done. That research has cost Isaac nothing other than his time. And he's in the hobby by doing that research. He's fulfilling some kind of drive or desire he has for the hobby by doing all that research all ahead of time. And that sets up some nice guardrails for Isaac as he starts to develop his projects. And you can do the same thing and have that fulfillment without spending a dime.
Yeah, research is free and it is so fun. I spent so much time last week looking at car floats, and particularly the junk that gets piled up on top of car floats, and particularly the junk that gets piled up on car floats in the year 1955. Like diving deep into the internet to try to find those photos and those forums where people are talking about those things and discussing those things to get ideas for what I would eventually want my layout to start to look like. It's hours and hours of just of free fun. And I think that is something to embrace, especially as a new model railroader, because all that research, both into like, prototype research, but also research into like, what is the best way of laying track? How do I wire layout? All that additional research as well. Also free, also fun, and will also help, make sure that you have great success moving forward in the hobby.
Proper planning prevents poor performance. And that's exactly what you can do, and make sure that you're spending your dollars wisely, getting the most out of it, and get that flywheel turning so that you stay enthused about our great hobby. So, Matt, appreciate you coming on and talking about that. Let's get to the question of the month, which is advice. We've been handing out advice throughout this podcast, and we asked the folks out there and what has been the best model railroading related advice that they've received. We got 6 great answers here, so we're going to take a listen to those and check them out. Let's start with Ben Gray.
G'day, Ray. My name is Ben. I'm from Newcastle in Australia. The best railway modelling advice I've received was something I read by Lance Mindheim, where he talks about building a layout that suits your lifestyle. When I read this, I was building a layout that was to fit a spare bedroom size, and for my lifestyle, I was traveling a lot, had a lot of work commitments, a lot of family commitments, and I just didn't have the time to sink into building this railway. After about a year or so, I still had just bench work and no trains running yet, and it really sapped my motivation to continue. I tore it all down and started building a smaller shelf layout that was probably about a third of that size, probably about 4.5 feet long. I finished that in less than a year, and it really encouraged me to continue and to build more layouts. And that's the best advice I can give someone that's starting out, is to start small, not just to start small, but to consider how it suits your lifestyle. And also, if you do start small, you can learn a lot of things along the way, have it finished a lot quicker, and it really encourages you to continue and to try bigger things as well. Love the podcast. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Well, thanks, Ben. You just proved kind of case in point, didn't you, with what we've been talking about today?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is starting small is great. Not only from just a cost savings perspective, but you're also getting trains running far sooner than on a large layout. And I think as soon as you can start to get your locomotive moving around on your layout, I think the better, especially if this is your first model railroad. You want to see your trains moving as soon as possible. And small layouts help you get there.
All right. I agree. Here we go with Darren Johns.
Hi, all. This is Daz from South Australia, Australia. So the question for this month, what has been the best model railroading related advice you've received? So when I'm building a layout, the best advice I ever received from my peers was get the track work down in its basic form and start running some trains and having some fun. That, from my point of view, really kept my interest going. Love seeing the trains running around because that's ultimately what we want to do. So I don't bog myself down too much on the finite electronic signaling and all that. Get trains running and have some fun. Ray and all the crew, I love the show. I've been binge listening to the podcast for a few months now, and I just really, really enjoy having all the types of guests you've in. So great job, and I'll hopefully come on the show one day.
Well, Daz, we'll definitely look forward to hearing your story, and thank you for answering the question of the month, which again is just that same thing about keeping that flywheel turning. Let's take a listen to Dave Honan.
Hi, Ray. This is Dave Honan from Snoqualmie, Washington. The best model railroading advice I've received has come from past podcast guests Matt Fricks and Isaac Fabris. They encouraged me to pick a subject and an era to model, then determine what industries would be featured on my layout. The track plan didn't have to be set in stone. I just needed to know what I was going to be doing. Their key advice was to then use that framework to establish guardrails for purchasing decisions. There are so many amazing models in the market and in the pipeline from large and small manufacturers alike, but how many of those items do I really need? I can't have it all, right? Setting limits lets me focus on buying only the stuff that will help advance the development of my rolling stock fleet and layout infrastructure without derailing progress by blowing up a limited budget. Making sound financial decisions also has the side benefit of heading off those difficult questions from my chief financial officer. I love the podcast, and I can't thank you enough for how you and all the co-hosts and guests have helped reignite my passion for the hobby after I was away from it for many years. Take care.
Oh man, that's just so awesome to hear, Dave. That you really, that's what the podcast is about, getting folks started. And I'm glad that you were able to reignite your passion and doing it with some great advice by two names we've mentioned earlier in the podcast, and setting those guardrails and just making sure that you're staying in between them and staying away from those bright, shiny objects.
I feel like these guys have all heard this episode somehow before they even called it. I don't know how that's possible. Like we could just skip right to these questions. I mean, this perfect. Exactly. Like find what you like. Like for me personally, like I love 2-bay covered hoppers. That was the thing that I built that first modular layout around was 2-bay covered hoppers. Cement. We're talking cement factory. Okay. So now I need to see, so by finding that one thing that you really super love and then using that as like your guide stone or whatever to build a layout around it really helps focus you in and keep you from buying things like auto racks when you don't need auto racks, right? That kind of thing. Even though you love auto racks, you don't need them, so don't buy them. So yeah, great advice.
That keeps you laser focused. So let's dabble into the 1/160th world with Dennis.
Hey y'all, my name is Dennis Colucci. I'm from Wabash Falls, New York, and probably the best piece of model railroading related advice that I've received is something that I saw in, I believe, someone's signature when I was first getting into trolling the forums and on trains.com. And that piece of advice was what allowed me to go on to eventually build out my fictional Balfour and Colucci Creek Southern Railroad, to build my first switching layout, and to basically get me to where I am today. And that piece of advice is known as rule number 1 of model railroading, which is if it's your model railroad, it's your rules. Do what you enjoy.
Well, that goes back kind of to the thought of, make sure that you're building the railroad for you and you're not worried about outside opinions. And if you're getting bad outside opinions, it's time to stop listening to them. Yeah.
Well, and us model railroaders, we are all very opinionated, right? We all think we have the best approach to the hobby. And, because I did it this way, everyone else should do it this way as well. And that's certainly not the case. I think everyone kind of comes with their own desires and their own wants and needs. And yeah, as long as you're happy, I mean, if you're happy in DC and you don't want to jump to DCC, that's fine. In my opinion, having that sound, having some of those extra features, I think is a great way to start out in the hobby. But if you're a DC guy, don't feel like my opinion should sway you one way or another. Whatever makes you happy, absolutely go with that.
Absolutely. There's more than one way to model railroad. That is absolutely for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take a listen to Mark.
My name is Mark Seenwick from Olathe, Kansas, model the Milwaukee Road beer line. And I'd say some of the best advice that I've been given over my years in model railroading is definitely just to try something. And if you don't like it, try it again. But if you don't do it, you'll never know.
Kind of goes back to that same thing I was saying earlier. You can talk the hobby so long, and then you got to do it. Get your hands dirty and give it a whirl.
Yeah, absolutely. I find myself sort of in an analysis paralysis sometimes, where it's like I want to do it absolutely perfect the first time, and it's never going to be right the first time. And knowing that, I think, is very freeing, because it means you can get in there, you can get your hands dirty, you can give yourself the space to screw up, and you can go back and you can fix it, right?
Absolutely. All right. And last but not least, Sam Dickinson.
Hi, Ray. Sam Dickinson from Evansville, Indiana. One of the best lessons that I learned while in college, and something that I think applies to model railroading, and especially when it comes to planning a layout, is keep it stupid simple. A lot of us tend to get caught up in the details of the model railroad, and we end up over planning or overextending or boxing ourselves in with our plans and designs to the point that it can't be fun or functional. By keeping it stupid simple, we are allowing ourselves to focus on just the bare essentials and build on from there. And then if we have the space and it is feasible, then we can start adding on a little more. And I think that also leads into the number 2 rule I learned, which is good enough for NASA, which means you don't have to have everything absolutely perfect in order for it to be acceptable to everyone. Hope that helps answer your question. Look forward to the other answers, and hope you all have a great day.
Well, thank you, Sam. Appreciate your answer. And I like the term overextend, right? And we talked about that earlier. Like when you start putting those plans together, it doesn't have to be the most complex of things. It doesn't have to be the most complex track design. Certainly doesn't have to be the most complex scenery.
Yeah.
You want to start with fundamentals.
Yeah, and keeping it stupid simple, as he says, keeps it affordable, right? Because you're not buying all that stuff that adds complication. And as a beginner, you don't want that complication. Complication can come later if you're looking for a real challenge. But if you can get your trains up and running quickly and keep it reliable and have some nice looking cars and some fun, interesting scenery techniques and stuff, you're very successful in the hobby at that point.
Absolutely. So I want to thank everybody who had submitted their answers to the question of the month. Each month we put up a question of the month on our website, aroundthelayout.com/question. You go on there, read the question, provide an answer by pressing on the button, record your answer, and you might just hear yourself here on the podcast. So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit more about where we can find you on YouTube?
Yeah, so my channel is MFRailroad. You can find it on YouTube there. I have a lot of videos out there, a lot of videos where I'm talking about my layout, but also my thoughts on the hobby. I am working on a brand new modular layout, like I said before, and I'm sort of chronicling that as I go. I've got a really good head of steam rolling on it right now, so I'll have videos coming up about bench work and track work and electrical and all those sort of things that are very beginner friendly or beginner focused, if you will. So you can check me out there for sure.
Excellent. We'll also provide links to Matt's YouTube channel on our website, again, aroundthelayout.com/142. Matt, want to thank you for coming on and helping us guide some people down the path of affordable model railroading. not breaking the bank, but getting that flywheel turning and getting some trains on the track and getting to a point where you can start enjoying our great hobby.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.